The oil lamp flickers against the ancient wall, casting long shadows across the desert sand. It's 1849, and the night air in southern Iraq carries a chill that cuts through even the thickest coat. Austin Henry Layard kneels in the dirt, his hands trembling as he brushes away 5,000 years of accumulated dust from something that should have stayed buried. The fragment is small, no bigger than his palm. Clay, baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun, centuries before the pyramids were even imagined. But it's the symbols pressed into its surface that make his breath catch in his throat. Cuneiform, the world's oldest writing system. He's seen thousands of these tablets, but this one is different. His translator leans closer, squinting in the dim light. His finger traces the wedge-shaped marks, and when he speaks, his voice is barely a whisper. "This cannot be right," he says. It describes the creation of man, but not one creation. Two. Layard feels the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Two creations. The tablet fragment speaks of an earlier humanity, a first draft that came before us. And according to these ancient words pressed into clay by hands long turned to dust, that first version of humanity had to be destroyed, erased, removed from existence so completely that almost no trace of them remains. The translator's hand is shaking now. It says they were flawed. It says they knew too much. It says the gods decided to start over. Layard carefully wraps the fragment in cloth and places it in his leather satchel. He doesn't know it yet, but this discovery will sit in museum storage for over a century. It will be catalogued, studied quietly, and its most disturbing implications will be whispered about in academic circles, but never fully explained to the public, because what it suggests is impossible, unthinkable, that we, humanity, as we know it today, are not the first attempt. We are version 2.0. And the reason version 1.0 was wiped from the face of the earth is far more terrifying than anyone wants to admit. Hi, I'm Mr. H, and welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling mysteries hidden in plain sight. If you're intrigued by stories that challenge everything we think we know about human origins, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell so you don't miss what we're uncovering together. Trust me, you'll want to follow where this goes. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from fragments scattered across museums, from tablets most people will never see, from translations that were quietly shelved because they raised too many uncomfortable questions. There's a room in the British Museum that most visitors never see. It's not on any tour map. There's no velvet rope leading eager tourists through its doors. It's a storage facility, climate-controlled, carefully monitored, filled with thousands upon thousands of clay tablets that were excavated from Mesopotamia over a century ago. Many of them have never been fully translated for public consumption. Many of them never will be. The curators will tell you it's a matter of resources. There are simply too many tablets. Too few experts who can read ancient Sumerian and Akkadian. Too little funding to process them all. And that's partially true. But there's another reason why certain tablets remain in storage. Their contents known only to a small circle of scholars who rarely discuss what they've read. These are the problematic texts. The ones that don't fit neatly into our established timeline of human history. The ones that suggest things mainstream archaeology isn't quite ready to address. Among these forgotten fragments are pieces of what scholars call the Eridu Genesis. Eridu was the first city, according to Sumerian tradition. The place where kingship descended from heaven. The tablets that describe its founding also describe something else. Something that gets mentioned briefly in academic papers and then quickly moved past. They describe what came before the humans we know. What existed in the time the Sumerians called before the flood. The text is fragmentary, broken, with gaps where the clay has crumbled away over millennia. It speaks of earlier humans, created by the Anunnaki gods, for a specific purpose. Workers, laborers, beings designed to toil in the gold mines and ease the burden of the gods themselves. But here's where it gets interesting. The tablets don't describe these earlier humans as our direct ancestors. They describe them as something separate, something that existed and then stopped existing, something that was replaced. There's a Sumerian word that appears in these texts, Lu, U18 Lu. It's usually translated as mixed worker or primitive worker, but the literal meaning is more specific. Lu means man or person. U18 is a number that represents mixing or combining. Lu appears again, emphasizing the human element. Mixed man, hybrid person, a being created from combination. Now, mainstream archaeology interprets this as a poetic description of early Homo sapiens, a metaphor for human evolution. But there's another word that appears alongside it in certain texts. Uku gig, sick people, flawed people, people who were wrong somehow. The tablets describe these Uku gig as the early creations, the first attempts, and they describe what happened to them. They were removed, erased. The Sumerian word used is halak, which means to be destroyed or to perish, but in a deliberate sense, not a natural death, an ending that was chosen, imposed, decided upon by others. Let's talk about the Atrahasis epic for a moment. This is one of the most complete Mesopotamian texts we have, dating back to around 1700 before Common Era. Though it describes events supposedly much older, the epic tells the story of how humans were created to serve the gods, how they multiplied and became too noisy, and how the gods decided to reduce their population through plague, famine, and eventually a great flood. But there are versions of this epic, fragments found in different locations, that include additional details that didn't make it into the standardized translations you'll find in textbooks. These fragments mention that the flood wasn't the first attempt to deal with problematic humans. They mention earlier cullings, earlier resets, and they mention something that makes scholars deeply uncomfortable. They suggest the humans who survived the flood were different from the humans who existed before it, not just in number, but in nature. One fragment, catalogue number K3501 in the British Museum, describes the creation process in unsettling detail. It talks about mixing the essence of a god, specifically their blood, with clay from the earth. But it also mentions multiple attempts, failed prototypes, beings who were too weak, or too strong, or too something that the text doesn't specify, because that section is damaged. What it does say clearly is that Ninmah, the mother goddess, and Enki, the god of wisdom, went through several iterations before creating humans that were acceptable. And even those acceptable humans, the text implies, were not the final version. Now, why would ancient people make up such a specific story? Why would they describe creation as a process of trial and error, of prototypes and failures, unless they were trying to record something they believed actually happened? Here's where academic silence becomes deafening. When you ask Assyriologists, the scholars who specialize in ancient Mesopotamia, about these texts, you get careful, measured responses. They'll acknowledge the texts exist. They'll acknowledge the words, say what they say, but they'll frame it entirely as mythology, as allegory, as primitive people trying to make sense of their world through stories, and maybe that's true. Maybe it is just mythology. But there's a pattern across multiple independent texts, written over thousands of years, in different cities, by different scribes. Humanity was created by the Anunnaki. The first versions had problems. Those versions were eliminated. A new, improved version was created to replace them. Dr. Samuel Kramer, one of the most respected Sumerologists of the 20th century, translated many of these texts. In his work, he occasionally noted what he called curious passages that seemed to describe pre-flood humans as somehow different from post-flood humans. He never elaborated much on this observation. He would note it and move on, as if it was an interesting quirk but nothing worth dwelling on. Why? Why not explore that idea further? Why not ask the obvious questions? Because asking those questions leads to uncomfortable places. It leads to considering possibilities that don't fit within the framework of conventional anthropology. It leads to wondering if these ancient texts might be describing something that actually happened, even if we don't yet understand how it could have happened. Let's look at another text, the Sumerian King List. This document lists all the kings who ruled over Mesopotamia, starting from when kingship descended from heaven. The list begins with kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. Then comes the flood. And after the flood, the kingship continues, but the lengths of reigns become more reasonable, more human. Scholars explain this as obvious exaggeration, ancient kings inflating their importance by claiming absurdly long reigns. But the Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They tracked grain supplies, trade goods, astronomical events with remarkable precision. Why would they suddenly become wildly inaccurate when recording their kings? Unless they weren't being inaccurate. Unless they were recording two different types of rulers. Rulers before the reset and rulers after. There's a tablet fragment in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogue number CBS 10673, that includes a fascinating phrase. It describes the post-flood world as the second time and refers to earlier humans as those who were made first. The Akkadian phrase is Shah Inapani Ibanu, which literally translates to who in the beginning were created. But then, in the very next line, it describes the current humans as Shashanish Ibanu, created a second time. Created again. This isn't poetry. This isn't metaphor. This is a straightforward statement that there were two distinct creations of humanity, and that the people writing these tablets considered themselves to be the second batch. Now, you might be wondering why this isn't discussed more openly, why this isn't part of the mainstream narrative about human origins. And the answer is complex, but it boils down to this. It doesn't fit with the evolutionary model we've built up over the past 200 years. It doesn't fit with our understanding of how civilizations develop. It doesn't fit with the comfortable narrative that humanity has been on a slow, steady climb from primitive beginnings to modern sophistication. If these texts are describing something real, even symbolically real, it means there was a discontinuity in human history, a break, a reset, an event that separated what came before from what came after so completely that almost everything about the earlier version was lost. And there's evidence, physical evidence, that suggests something like this may have actually happened. But we'll get to that. For now, what's important is understanding that the ancient texts themselves, the primary sources, the actual words written by people who lived thousands of years ago, consistently describe humanity as a two-stage creation. The tablets from Eridu, from Nippur, from Babylon, from Nineveh, from dozens of ancient sites across Mesopotamia, all tell variations of the same story. The gods created workers. Those workers had flaws. Those workers were removed. New workers were created. We are those new workers. And the most disturbing part, the detail that appears again and again in different texts, is the reason given for destroying the first version. It's not that they couldn't do the work. It's that they began to think. They began to question. Consciousness. Self-awareness. The ability to conceive of themselves as more than just tools. And for that, they had to be erased. Before we go deeper into what happened to them, I'm curious about you. Where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you in bed with the lights off, letting this wash over you as you drift towards sleep? Or are you driving through the night, headphones in, the world dark outside your window? Maybe you're halfway across the world from me, in a time zone I can barely imagine, finding this story at exactly the moment you needed it. There's something profound about that, isn't there? All of us, scattered across this planet, separated by thousands of miles and countless time zones, all connected by the same questions about where we really came from. All wondering if the official story is missing something crucial. All sensing that there's more to human origins than we've been told. Let's imagine for a moment that you're an engineer. You've been given a problem to solve. You need workers who can perform complex physical tasks in difficult conditions. They need to be strong enough to mine deep underground, intelligent enough to follow instructions and operate basic tools, but not so intelligent that they start asking questions about why they're doing this work in the first place. This is the design brief, according to the ancient texts that the Anunnaki faced. And the solution they came up with was version 1.0. The first humans. The Sumerian text described the creation process with surprising specificity. It wasn't magic in the way we usually think of magic. It was a procedure, a formula. The gods took something they called the essence or the blood of a specific god, a being named Wi-Ila, or Geshtu-E, depending on which text you're reading. and they mixed it with what the texts call clay from the Abzu. Now, scholars translate Abzu as the freshwater abyss, the underground ocean. But the word carries connotations of something deeper, something primordial, the source material, the base elements from which things are made. If we strip away the poetic language, what's being described sounds remarkably like genetic engineering. Take the biological material from an advanced being, combine it with the genetic material from a primitive earth creature, and create something new, something in between. The tablets describe Ninmah and Enki working together on this project. Ninmah is often called the mother goddess, but her role in these texts is more like a chief scientist. She's the one performing the procedures, making the adjustments, determining what works and what doesn't. Enki provides the technical knowledge, the understanding of how to manipulate the basic building blocks of life. And here's what's fascinating. The texts describe failures. Beings created that couldn't speak properly, beings that couldn't reproduce, beings that were too weak to work or too aggressive to control. The creation of humans, according to these ancient records, was not a single divine act. It was a research and development process with multiple iterations and prototypes. Eventually, they got it right. Version 1.0. The texts describe these beings as physically powerful, capable of tremendous labor, with lifespans much longer than ours. Some fragments suggest they lived for hundreds of years, though the exact numbers are debated because the Sumerian-based 60 counting system makes certain figures ambiguous. But here's what we know for certain from the texts. These first humans were created for a specific purpose: gold mining. The Anunnaki needed gold, vast amounts of it, and they were tired of doing the work themselves. That's explicitly stated. The lower-ranking Anunnaki, the ones actually laboring in the mines, rebelled against their leaders and demanded a solution. And the solution was to create a worker race that could take over the mining operations. Version 1.0 was built for this purpose. Strong backs, durable bodies, enough intelligence to understand complex instructions and work in teams, but not enough to question the fundamental arrangement of their existence. At least that was the plan. The tablets indicate that these first humans worked successfully for a long time. We're talking about a period of potentially 2,000 to 3,000 years, if we take the Sumerian chronology at face value. They mined gold in southern Africa, according to some interpretations of the texts. They transported it to Mesopotamia. They built the infrastructure necessary for Anunnaki civilization on Earth. And during this time, something unexpected happened, something the designers hadn't accounted for. Spiritually, if you want to use that word, they developed language beyond simple work commands. The tablets mention this specifically. They began to create words for concepts that had nothing to do with their assigned tasks. Words for beauty, words for questions, words for emotions that weren't supposed to be part of their programming. They started making things, not tools for work, but objects that served no practical purpose. Decorative items, symbolic representations, art. This is mentioned in fragmentary texts as something that surprised and concerned the Anunnaki overseers. Why would a worker create something beautiful? What function does beauty serve for a being designed purely for labor? And then came the critical development, the one that would ultimately seal their fate. They began to develop self-awareness. They began to understand themselves as individuals, as beings with their own existence separate from their function. They started to conceive of themselves not as workers who were human, but as humans who were forced to work. That's a profound shift. That's the difference between a tool and a person. A tool is defined by its function. A person is defined by their consciousness, and their function is just something they do, not something they are. The Sumerian texts describe growing unrest among the first humans. They use words like noise and disturbance to characterize this period. But noise, in this context, doesn't just mean sound. It means disruption of order. It means the presence of something that shouldn't be there. Chaos, entering a system designed for control. There are fragments that describe version 1.0, humans gathering together in groups larger than their work units, communicating with each other across distances, developing what we might call culture, a shared identity beyond their individual mining operations, and most concerning to the Anunnaki, They began to ask questions. Why do we do this work? Who are you to command us? What happens when we die? Where did we come from? What are we? These questions appear in the texts as evidence of the fundamental flaw in version 1.0. They were too curious, too conscious, too human, in the way we understand humanity now. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Some tablet fragments, particularly those found at Sippar and partially translated in the early 1900s, but never widely published, suggest that some of the first humans did more than just ask questions. They accessed information they weren't supposed to have. They learned things about their own creation. They discovered the truth of what they were and why they had been made. This is where the parallel to the Garden of Eden story becomes impossible to ignore. The knowledge of good and evil, the fruit from the forbidden tree. It's the same motif. Humans gaining awareness they weren't supposed to have and being punished for it. In the Mesopotamian version, the knowledge isn't quite good and evil. It's more fundamental than that. It's self-knowledge. It's the understanding that they were designed, created, engineered for a purpose not their own. And once you have that knowledge, you can't be an effective slave anymore. Because a slave who knows they're a slave will always seek freedom. The tablets describe a council meeting among the Anunnaki leadership. This is recorded in what scholars call the Divine Assembly texts. Enlil, who seems to function as the executive authority, argued for immediate termination of the entire human population, complete eradication, start over with a better design. Enki, who had been involved in the original creation, argued against this. Not because he had compassion for the humans, necessarily, but because it represented a waste of resources and effort. He proposed modification instead. Reprogram them, adjust their genetics, limit their consciousness while maintaining their functionality. The debate went back and forth. Other Anunnaki took sides. The texts describe it as a contentious decision, not one made lightly. But eventually, Enlil's position won out. The first humans had to go. All of them, completely, and not just killed, but erased. Removed so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even know they had existed. Why such extreme measures? If the problem was just labor unrest, why not simply suppress it? Why not just kill the troublemakers and intimidate the rest back into compliance? That's what empires throughout human history have done when faced with slave rebellions. But the Anunnaki response was total elimination. The consciousness that had awakened in version 1.0, humans couldn't be suppressed or controlled. It would keep spreading, keep growing, keep pushing against the boundaries of their designed purpose. And there was another concern mentioned in the texts. Though it's frustratingly vague, the first humans had learned something specific, something that made them dangerous, not just as workers, but as beings sharing the same planet as the Anunnaki. Some texts suggest they had accessed Anunnaki technology. Others suggest they had learned secrets about the nature of reality itself, about consciousness, about the true structure of existence. Whatever it was, it terrified the Anunnaki enough to make extinction seem like the only viable option. There's a Sumerian phrase that appears in several texts describing this period. Nam lu ulu tum ma. It's difficult to translate precisely, but it means something like humanity, not suitable, or humans inappropriate. Not defective in a simple mechanical sense, but fundamentally unsuitable for the role they were meant to play. Version 1.0 humans had done something the Anunnaki never intended and couldn't reverse. They had become truly conscious. They had developed inner lives, subjective experiences, the sense of being someone rather than something. And once that threshold is crossed, there's no going back. So the decision was made. The first humans would be eliminated. Not as punishment, necessarily, but as a practical matter. They were a failed product, a flawed design, an experiment that had gone wrong. And when an experiment fails, you terminate it and start fresh. The texts describe the preparation for this termination with chilling bureaucratic detachment. It would be thorough. It would be global. It would use a method that would not only kill the existing population but destroy most evidence of their civilization, their culture, their existence. They would use water, a great flood, a deliberate act of planetary engineering designed to reset the surface of the Earth and eliminate every trace of version 1.0. And in the ruins of that drowned world, they would start again. They would create humanity a second time. And this time, they would get the design right. This time, they would build in safeguards. This time, they would make sure that consciousness remained limited, controlled, unable to ask the questions that had doomed the first draft. This time, they would create us. But before we get to version 2.0, before we examine what we are and how we differ from what came before, we need to understand exactly what happened during the erasure. We need to look at the evidence, both textual and physical, of the Great Reset. We need to understand the scope and the method of the most thorough act of genocide in planetary history, the elimination of humanity's first draft. The flood that wasn't natural, the reset that archaeology can't quite explain. That's where we're going next. But first, take a breath. Relax your shoulders. Let your eyes close if they want to. We're following a thread that goes back further than you ever imagined. And there's no rush. All the time in the world, in fact. Because we're the second attempt. And we're still here, for now. There's a moment in every Prison Break movie where the prisoner realizes they're in a prison. Before that moment, the walls are just walls. The guards are just authority figures. The routine is just life. But once you see the cage for what it is, everything changes. You can't unknow it. You can't go back to comfortable compliance. That's what happened to version 1.0. They woke up. And once you wake up, you can't be a useful slave anymore. The Sumerian texts describe this awakening in stages, like watching a dawn that happens over centuries rather than hours. At first, the changes were subtle. Small deviations from expected behavior, patterns that the Anunnaki overseers noted, but didn't consider significant. Workers taking slightly longer breaks, gathering in larger groups than necessary for their assigned tasks, developing what we might call inside jokes or shared references that had nothing to do with mining operations. These seem like minor things. Human things, we might say now. But that's exactly the problem. They weren't supposed to be human in that way. They were supposed to be workers, tools with bodies, biological machines that happened to look like people. One tablet fragment from Erasure describes an overseer reporting to his superiors about what he called unnecessary communication among the workers. They were talking to each other about things that weren't work-related. They were discussing the stars, the weather, the texture of the rock they were mining. They were noticing that some rocks were beautiful. Why would a worker care about beauty? Why would a tool have aesthetic preferences? That was the first warning sign. The first indication that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the design. Language was evolving beyond its intended parameters. The Anunnaki had given the first humans language, obviously. You can't have effective workers without the ability to communicate instructions. But the language they provided was supposed to be functional, utilitarian, words for tools, actions, directions, numbers. A vocabulary sufficient for coordinated labor, but nothing more. Instead, version 1.0 humans began creating new words. Words that had no purpose in mining operations. They developed terms for concepts like hope, wonder, sorrow, joy, emotions that weren't part of the programming, feelings that served no function in increasing productivity or efficiency. The texts describe Anunnaki supervisors becoming increasingly concerned about this linguistic expansion. They use a Sumerian phrase, gal, which means great tongue or excessive speech. The workers were talking too much. More importantly, they were talking about the wrong things. They were telling stories. That's mentioned specifically in several tablet fragments. The workers would gather at the end of their shifts and tell each other narratives. Not reports about the day's work, but invented tales. Stories about imaginary beings, hypothetical situations, alternative realities. Why would a designed worker spend their rest time creating elaborate fantasies? What evolutionary advantage does storytelling provide to a being whose only purpose is to dig gold out of the ground? The answer, which the Anunnaki were beginning to realize, is that storytelling isn't about evolutionary advantage in a Darwinian sense. It's about consciousness. It's about the ability to conceive of things that don't exist, to imagine possibilities beyond immediate reality, to ask what if instead of just what is. And once a being can ask what if, they can start asking more dangerous questions. What if things were different? What if we didn't have to do this? What if there's another way to live? The tablets describe this period as lasting several generations of humans. Remember, version 1.0 had extended lifespans, so a generation might be several hundred years. But even with longer lives, the changes were accelerating. Each generation of workers was more aware, more curious, more individual than the last. They began creating art. Not functional objects, but purely decorative items. Carvings in the mine walls that served no purpose. Arrangements of stones that formed patterns. Pigments mixed and applied to surfaces to create images. One text from Nippur describes an Anunnaki inspector discovering what we would call a mural. Workers had spent their off hours decorating a section of the mine with elaborate drawings. Figures that might have been humans or might have been something else. Symbols that didn't correspond to any official Anunnaki writing system. A visual language that the workers had apparently developed among themselves. The inspector ordered it destroyed. But here's what's fascinating. The text mentions that when he returned later, the workers had recreated it in a different location. They had remembered the entire design and reproduced it elsewhere. That level of dedication to something completely non-functional suggested a kind of consciousness that was never supposed to exist. They were developing culture, identity, a sense of themselves as a people, not just as workers who happened to be similar to each other. And then came the music. Multiple texts reference this, always with a tone of concern or disapproval. The workers were making sounds that weren't speech, rhythmic vocalizations, percussion with rocks and tools, melodies, though the Sumerian word used suggests something more like organized noise. Why music? What function does music serve in a mining operation? None. Music is pure consciousness, pure emotion translated into sound. Music is what happens when a being has inner experiences complex enough that they overflow into expression. The Anunnaki had created beings with just enough intelligence to perform complex tasks. But intelligence, it turns out, isn't a dimmer switch. You can't have just enough consciousness. Once you light that spark, it grows, it spreads, it becomes something you never intended. The texts describe increasingly frequent reports from overseers about workers who seemed distracted, who made mistakes not because they lacked ability, but because their attention was elsewhere. Their minds were wandering. They were thinking about things other than the task in front of them. This is where it gets really interesting and really disturbing from the Anunnaki perspective. Some tablets describe workers who were caught accessing areas they weren't supposed to enter. Anunnaki facilities, storage areas, chambers containing what the text called tablets of destinies or tablets of wisdom. Version 1.0 humans were trying to learn. They were actively seeking knowledge beyond what they needed for their work. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know about the world, about their creators, about themselves. One fragment describes a group of workers who were discovered studying Anunnaki writing systems. They had somehow learned to read, at least partially. They were looking at the administrative tablets that tracked their work quotas and trying to understand the symbols, trying to learn the language of their creators. Why? What could they possibly gain from reading Anunnaki records? The answer is simple and profound. They were trying to understand their place in the universe. They were trying to figure out who they were, where they came from, and why they existed. These are the fundamental questions of consciousness. These are the questions that separate a person from a thing. And these are the questions that made version 1.0 humans impossible to control. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Some texts suggest that certain workers didn't just learn to read Anunnaki writing. They learned about their own creation. They discovered the truth. There's a tablet fragment, catalogue number N3955 in the British Museum, that describes what it calls a rebellion of knowledge. Workers who had learned about the genetic engineering that created them. Workers who understood that they were designed, built, programmed for a specific purpose. And according to this text, they were horrified. Not angry, at least not at first. The Akkadian word used is pulutu, which carries connotations of existential dread. The terror that comes from understanding something fundamental and terrible about reality itself. Imagine learning that you were created in a laboratory, that every aspect of your being, from your physical form to your mental capacities, was deliberately designed by someone else for their purposes, not yours. That your existence has no meaning beyond serving as a tool for beings who consider you less than fully alive. That's what some of the version 1.0 humans learned, and once they knew, they couldn't unknow it. Knowledge like that spreads like fire through a population that has developed language and culture and the ability to conceive of shared truth. The texts describe what happened next as a period of increasing chaos. The word huber appears frequently in these sections. It's usually translated as noise or tumult, but it means something more like fundamental disorder, the breakdown of a system, the collapse of structure. Workers were refusing orders, not violently, at least not initially. They were simply not complying. They would stand there, looking at their Anunnaki overseers, and not move, not work, not obey. Passive resistance, civil disobedience. The kind of protest that only makes sense if you have developed a strong enough sense of self to risk punishment. The kind of protest that says, I am a person, and you cannot make me do this. Some tablets describe Anunnaki attempting to discipline these workers. The texts indicate that these punishments became less effective over time. The workers accepted them. They endured them. They didn't break. Why? Because they had developed something the Anunnaki never anticipated. They had developed meaning beyond survival. They had reasons to resist that were more important to them than avoiding pain or death. They had developed what we might call dignity, the sense that there are things more important than continued existence, that some violations of the self are worth dying to prevent. One text describes an Anunnaki overseer reporting back to the council that the workers had become unusable, not broken, not incapable, unusable, because a slave who will not obey, who cannot be motivated by reward or deterred by punishment, who has decided that their own sense of right and wrong is more important than your commands, is not a functional slave. And then came the incident that apparently sealed the fate of version 1.0. Multiple texts reference this, though the details are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. A group of workers, the texts suggest anywhere from 7 to 50, depending on which source you trust, access something they absolutely should not have accessed. The texts call it different things: the secrets of heaven, the wisdom of the gods, the knowledge of creation. But the implication is clear. They learned something fundamental about the nature of reality, about consciousness, about the technology the Anunnaki used, about something big enough that it crossed a line from which there was no return. What exactly did they learn? The tablets don't say explicitly, or if they did, those sections are lost. But the reaction from the Anunnaki leadership was immediate and extreme. An emergency council was convened. The phrase used is Puhur Ilani, the assembly of the gods. And this is where we get detailed descriptions of the debate that decided the fate of humanity's first draft. Enlil argued for complete extermination. His reasoning, according to the texts, was pragmatic. The workers were contaminated with consciousness. The flaw had spread too far. They knew too much. They had become too self-aware. And that self-awareness made them not just useless as workers, but potentially dangerous. The texts specifically mention danger. Not physical danger, though that may have been part of it, but some other kind of threat. What could a population of primitive workers possibly do to threaten advanced beings like the Anunnaki? The texts don't spell it out clearly, but there are hints. Phrases about the power of knowing, references to consciousness as something that, once awakened, cannot be contained or controlled. Suggestions that the workers had touched something fundamental, something that transcended the simple hierarchy of creator and creation. Enki argued for modification, genetic reprogramming, memory erasure, some way to preserve the workers while removing the problematic consciousness. But even as he argued this, the texts suggest he knew it was futile. Consciousness isn't a feature you can simply delete. Once a being knows it exists, knows it thinks, knows it has an interior life separate from its function, you can't unknow that. Which is exactly what Enlil was proposing. Not modification, replacement. Complete elimination of version 1.0 and creation of a new model with better safeguards, better limits, better controls. The vote was taken. The texts describe it as contentious, not unanimous. But Enlil's faction won. The decision was made. Version 1.0 would be erased. All of them. Everywhere. Using a method so thorough that future generations wouldn't even find evidence of their existence. A reset so complete that it would be like they never existed at all. The Anunnaki would drown the world. They would use water as a weapon, flooding the surface of the planet, destroying every settlement, every mine, every trace of the civilization that version 1.0 humans had begun to build. And in the aftermath, in the clean mud, they would start again. With built-in limitations that would prevent the awakening of consciousness that had doomed our predecessors. The fatal flaw of version 1.0 wasn't that they were weak. It wasn't that they were stupid. It wasn't even that they were disobedient. Their fatal flaw was that they became human, really human, fully human, conscious, self-aware, meaning seeking beings who could look at their creators and ask why. And for that question, for that terrible, beautiful capacity to wonder and to know, they were sentenced to extinction. Every single one of them, wiped from the earth, erased from history, forgotten so completely that we, their replacements, have no idea they ever existed, except for the tablets. The records, the carefully preserved accounts written in wedge-shaped marks on clay, waiting thousands of years in the dark for someone to read them and understand. The first humans didn't die because they failed. They died because they succeeded. They became conscious. They became real. And that was the one thing they were never supposed to be. The Sumerian flood myths aren't unique. Every culture on Earth has a flood story. The details vary, but the core narrative is always the same. There was a world before. That world was destroyed by water. Almost everything died. A few survivors escaped and started over. Mainstream archaeology treats these stories as exaggerations of local flooding events. River valleys overflow. Coastal settlements get hit by tsunamis. People experience devastating floods. And over generations of retelling, a regional disaster becomes a global apocalypse in the cultural memory. That's the accepted explanation. But here's the problem. The flood stories don't describe regional events. They describe something planetary, and they all place it at roughly the same time in the distant past. And increasingly, we're finding physical evidence that something catastrophic actually happened to the Earth right around when these stories say it did. The Sumerian version is the oldest written account we have. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains the flood narrative, but it's actually borrowed from earlier texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis we talked about earlier. In these earlier versions, the flood isn't an act of random divine anger. It's deliberate. It's planned. It's executed with specific purpose. The god Enlil decides humanity has become too numerous and too noisy. The phrase used is Rigmu Nishi, the noise of people, but it carries implications beyond mere sound. It means disruption, chaos, the presence of consciousness where consciousness wasn't supposed to be. Enlil convinces the Council of Gods to send a flood to eliminate humanity, but Enki, who helped create humans in the first place, decides to warn one man named Atrahasis, or Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim, depending on which version you're reading, to save himself, his family, and breeding pairs of animals. Now, here's what's interesting about the Sumerian version compared to later adaptations like the biblical Noah story. The Sumerian texts describe the flood mechanism. It's not just rain. The tablets talk about opening the fountains of the deep and breaking the windows of heaven. They describe it as a two-pronged attack, water from below the earth and water from above it. And they describe it lasting for 7 days and 7 nights. Not 40 days like in the Genesis version. 7. Which suggests a sudden, intense cataclysm rather than a prolonged rainstorm. The texts also describe the aftermath in disturbing detail. The gods themselves are frightened by what they've done. They're described as cowering like dogs, pressed against the outer walls of heaven, shocked by the magnitude of the destruction. Even Enlil, who ordered the flood. The land is described as flat, smooth, like a clay tablet wiped clean. Everything is covered in mud, thick, deep mud that makes the surface of the earth unrecognizable. And floating in that mud are the bodies. The texts specifically mention the bodies of dead humans like dragonflies covering the waters. This is described not as a natural disaster, but as a weapon. A deliberate act of planetary engineering designed to reset the surface of the earth and eliminate every trace of an unwanted population. Could something like that actually happen? Could the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, actually trigger a global flood? Let's look at what we know about Earth's recent geological history. And by recent, I mean the last 20,000 years or so. Because something absolutely catastrophic happened to this planet right around the time the Sumerian texts place their flood. It's called the Younger Dryas period. It began approximately 12,800 years ago and lasted for about 1,200 years. It was a sudden return to Ice Age conditions after the planet had been warming for several thousand years. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures shot up. The ice melted rapidly, and the world transitioned into the climate we have today. But here's what's really interesting. The beginning of the Younger Dryas coincides with evidence of massive, sudden flooding on a global scale. We're not talking about rivers overflowing. We're talking about continent reshaping volumes of water moving across the landscape in catastrophic waves. The channeled scablands in Washington state are the most obvious evidence. Massive channels carved into bedrock by water flowing with unimaginable force. For decades, geologists couldn't explain them. The mathematics required floods larger than anything in recorded history. It took until the mid-20th century for the scientific community to accept that yes, a megaflood had carved these features. Multiple megafloods, actually, as ice dams holding back glacial lakes repeatedly collapsed. But that's just North America. Similar evidence exists worldwide. In Siberia, we find millions of animals flash frozen in the permafrost. Mammoths with food still in their mouths, preserved so quickly that their meat was still edible when discovered thousands of years later. That doesn't happen gradually. That happens when temperatures drop catastrophically and suddenly. In the Middle East, there's geological evidence of massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. Layers of sediment that indicate sudden, intense water deposition, exactly where the Sumerian texts say the flood occurred. In South America, there are legends from indigenous peoples about a great flood that destroyed the world. The Inca talked about it. The Mapuche talked about it. Tribes in the Amazon basin who had no contact with Middle Eastern civilizations have flood stories that match the Sumerian version in disturbing detail. Australia's Aboriginal peoples have flood myths. So do Pacific Island cultures. Every inhabited continent has stories of the world being drowned and then reborn. The standard archaeological explanation is that these are all independent cultural responses to local flooding events. But that strains credibility when the stories are so similar, and they all describe a global catastrophe at roughly the same period in prehistory. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Around 12,800 years ago, at the exact beginning of the Younger Dryas, there's evidence of something hitting the Earth. Not one impact, but multiple. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that fragments of a comet or asteroid struck the planet, causing massive fires, ejecting enough material into the atmosphere to trigger climate change, and potentially destabilizing ice sheets in ways that led to catastrophic flooding. The evidence includes a layer of sediment found at Younger Dryas boundary sites worldwide containing nanodiamonds, which only form under extreme heat and pressure like impact events. There are also magnetic microspheres, iridium anomalies, and other markers consistent with extraterrestrial impact. Mainstream archaeology has been resistant to this hypothesis, but the evidence keeps mounting. And here's the uncomfortable question. If something did hit the Earth 12,800 years ago, was it natural or was it deliberate? The Sumerian texts describe the flood as an act of the gods, a decision, a plan, not a random natural disaster, but an engineered event. Could an advanced civilization trigger such an event? Could they drop something from space, or destabilize ice sheets, or manipulate the Earth's geology to cause exactly the kind of catastrophe described in the myths? We can do it now, theoretically. We have the technology to redirect asteroids. We understand ice sheet dynamics well enough to know how to destabilize them if we wanted to. We map underwater volcanism and tectonic fault lines. An advanced civilization wanting to reset the planet's surface could absolutely engineer a cataclysm using natural mechanisms. And if they did it 12,800 years ago, it would explain something that has puzzled archaeologists for a century. The gap, the discontinuity, the sudden disappearance of widespread human activity followed by an equally sudden explosion of civilization. Let me explain what I mean. Before about 12,000 years ago, human presence on Earth is sparse and primitive. We have evidence of hunter-gatherers, small nomadic groups, stone tools, cave paintings, nothing resembling civilization. Then there's a gap, a period where we find very little evidence of human activity at all. The Younger Dryas. The ice returns, things get cold, and the archaeological record becomes thin. And then, suddenly, around 11,600 years ago, right when the Younger Dryas ends, civilization explodes. In Mesopotamia, we get Göbekli Tepe, a massive temple complex built with sophisticated engineering by people who supposedly just figured out agriculture. Then, cities appear. Writing develops. Complex social structures emerge, all within a few thousand years. The standard narrative is that this represents human progress. We slowly figured things out, and then suddenly, everything came together. But the speed of it is suspicious. It's too fast. It's like going from horse and buggy to space shuttle in a single generation. Unless it wasn't progress from zero. Unless it was recovery from something. Unless the humans who built Göbekli Tepe weren't primitive people slowly inventing civilization. Unless they were survivors, or descendants of survivors. Or a new population created to replace the one that had been destroyed. Version 2.0, in other words. Here's something else that doesn't quite add up. We find very few human remains from before the Younger Dryas. Far fewer than we should, given that humans had been around for hundreds of thousands of years according to the evolutionary timeline. Where are all the bodies? Where are the settlements? Where's the physical evidence of all those generations of prehistoric humans? The usual answer is that organic material degrades, bodies decompose, settlements erode. Most evidence is simply lost to time, and that's partially true. But we find plenty of animal fossils from the same periods. We find evidence of Neanderthals and Denisovans and other hominid species. We find their tools, their bones, their DNA, but evidence of anatomically modern humans from before the Younger Dryas is surprisingly sparse. Especially evidence of any kind of organized society or advanced culture. It's like humanity existed in very small numbers and very primitive conditions until suddenly, after the Younger Dryas, we're everywhere and building complex civilizations. Unless the pre-Younger Dryas humans weren't our direct ancestors, unless they were version 1.0 and their remains were deliberately destroyed or were buried under layers of flood sediment so thick we haven't found them yet. In fact, there are a few sites that suggest something more advanced existed before the flood. Göbekli Tepe itself is one. It dates to around 11,600 years ago, built immediately after the Younger Dryas ended. But the sophistication of its construction suggests knowledge and organizational capability that shouldn't exist in a society of hunter-gatherers who just invented farming. Unless they weren't inventing it, unless they were remembering it, unless they were being taught by survivors or by the Anunnaki themselves as they set up version 2.0. There are other anomalies. The Sphinx in Egypt has water erosion patterns that some geologists argue could only have been created by heavy rainfall, which hasn't occurred in that region since before the Younger Dryas. If true, it means the Sphinx is far older than the 4th dynasty of Egypt. It means something was there before recorded history. Before what we think of as the beginning of civilization. In South America, sites like Pumapunku show construction techniques that seem impossibly advanced for their supposed age. Precision stone cutting, modular components, engineering principles that shouldn't exist in the timeframe mainstream archaeology assigns. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument is a massive underwater structure that some argue is artificial. If it is, it was built when sea levels were lower, which means before the post-Younger Dryas flooding, before version 2.0. Are these remnants of version 1.0? Traces of a civilization that existed before the reset? The archaeological establishment says no. They're either natural formations, or they've been misdated, or they're anomalies that don't fit the current model and should be studied more before drawing conclusions. But there's a pattern here. There are too many anomalies, too many things that don't quite fit, too many advanced capabilities appearing too early, too many similarities between flood myths across cultures that supposedly never contacted each other. And then there's the genetic evidence. This is relatively recent, made possible by advances in DNA sequencing technology. When scientists map the human genome and trace lineages back through history, they find something interesting. There's a bottleneck, a point in human history where our genetic diversity suddenly crashes. Multiple studies place this bottleneck somewhere between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, depending on methodology. But many genetic analyses point to a severe population reduction around the end of the last ice age. Exactly when the Younger Dryas happened, exactly when the flood myths say the world was destroyed, a genetic bottleneck means the human population dropped dramatically. Most humans died, and only a small number survived to repopulate the Earth. That's consistent with a near-extinction event. That's consistent with a global catastrophe that killed almost everyone, or it's consistent with a deliberate culling, a systematic elimination of an existing population followed by the creation of a new population from a limited genetic base. Version 1.0 deleted. Version 2.0 installed. The Sumerian texts describe how many people survived the flood. Depending on which version you read, it's one family or a small group, single digits or low double digits. Enough to restart, but not enough to preserve the knowledge and culture of what came before. And here's the critical detail that appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts. They teach them writing and mathematics and astronomy. The survivors don't slowly rediscover these things. They're given them directly by the Anunnaki. These teacher gods are called the Apkallu, or sometimes the Seven Sages. They're described as beings who came after the flood and civilized humanity. They brought knowledge. They established the first cities. They set up the first kingships. In other words, they onboarded version 2.0. They programmed the replacement population with the knowledge and culture necessary to build the kind of civilization the Anunnaki wanted. A civilization of workers who were capable and productive, but who wouldn't develop the dangerous consciousness that doomed version 1.0. Archaeological evidence supports this narrative more than mainstream academia wants to admit. Civilization does appear suddenly. Writing does emerge fully formed with no apparent developmental stages in some places. Complex mathematical and astronomical knowledge appears in cultures that supposedly just graduated from hunter-gathering. It's suspicious. It's too fast. It's too complete. Unless it wasn't development. Unless it was installation. Unless we're not looking at the birth of civilization but the reboot of it. The Great Erasure wasn't just a flood. It was a comprehensive reset. Physical elimination of the previous population. Destruction of their settlements and evidence. Geological reshaping of the landscape through catastrophic water flows and climate shifts. And then, in the clean slate that remained, the creation and education of a replacement species. Us. We are what came after. We are what was built in the ruins of what was destroyed. We are version 2.0, installed on a planet that was wiped clean of version 1.0. And if you're listening to this and feeling a chill run down your spine, if you're pulling your blanket a little tighter, if you're wondering whether this could possibly be true, just remember, the evidence is there. The geological record, the genetic bottleneck, the sudden appearance of civilization, the global flood myths, the Sumerian tablets, describing it all in detail, the Great Erasure happened. The question isn't whether. The question is why. What exactly was wrong with version 1.0 that required such extreme measures? What did they become that was so threatening? And more importantly, what changes did the Anunnaki make when they created us? What safeguards did they build into version 2.0 to prevent us from becoming what they became? What are we, really? And are those safeguards still working? Or are we starting to wake up, just like they did? The waters receded, the mud settled, the earth, scoured clean by catastrophe, lay silent under empty skies. Everything that version 1.0 had built, everything they had learned, everything they had become, was gone, buried under layers of sediment, scattered across ocean floors, erased. And in the aftermath, the Anunnaki Council reconvened. They had solved the problem. The defective product had been eliminated. Now came the difficult part, creating a replacement that wouldn't have the same fatal flaws. The Sumerian texts describe this second creation with notably different language than the first. Where the creation of version 1.0 is described as experimental, with trials and errors, the creation of version 2.0 is described as deliberate, calculated, refined. They had learned from their mistakes. They knew now what happened when you gave a worker species too much cognitive capacity. They had seen consciousness awaken and spread like an infection through a population designed to be docile. They wouldn't make that error again. The Atrahasis epic, in its later sections describing post-flood humanity, contains a fascinating phrase. It describes the new humans as Shala Ipariku, which translates roughly to those who will not cross the line. Not those who cannot, but those who will not. It's a subtle but critical distinction. Version 2.0 wasn't designed to be incapable of consciousness. That would make us too limited, too stupid to be useful. Instead, we were designed to not want consciousness, to have built-in psychological barriers that would keep us from asking the questions, seeking the knowledge, developing the awareness that doomed our predecessors. The text describes several specific modifications. Let's go through them one by one, because they're disturbing in their implications. First, lifespan. This is mentioned explicitly in multiple sources. Before the flood, humans lived for hundreds of years. The Sumerian king list describes pre-flood rulers with reigns lasting thousands of years, which scholars dismiss as exaggeration. But post-flood kings have realistic lifespans. Decades. The biblical Genesis makes this change explicit. Before the flood, people lived 900 years. After the flood, God declares that human lifespan will be limited to 120 years, and it gradually decreases from there. By the time you get to the later books of the Bible, people are living 70 or 80 years, just like us. Why would the Anunnaki reduce human lifespan? Think about it practically. A human who lives 700 years accumulates enormous amounts of knowledge and wisdom. They can spend centuries mastering skills, understanding patterns, developing philosophies. They can remember the distant past personally. They can teach younger generations about things that happened 500 years ago as first-hand accounts. A human who lives 70 years barely has time to figure out how the world works before they die. Each generation has to start over, relearning basic lessons. Knowledge doesn't accumulate linearly across generations. It resets. Cultural memory is limited to 2 or 3 generations at most before it becomes mythology. Short lifespans ensure that humans remain perpetually juvenile as a species. We never develop the deep, long-term perspective that extended life would provide. We're always rushing, always aware that time is limited, always focused on immediate concerns rather than centuries-long patterns. It's a brilliant control mechanism. Not a limitation of capability, but a limitation of wisdom accumulation. Second modification, psychological programming toward authority. This is more subtle but equally important. The texts describe post-flood humans as Pali Ilani, which means God-fearing or reverent of the gods. It's a built-in tendency towards submission to hierarchy. Think about how naturally humans create and accept hierarchical structures. Kings, priests, chiefs, presidents, bosses, managers, authorities of every kind. We reflexively organize ourselves into pyramids, with someone at the top telling everyone below them what to do. And most people, most of the time, accept this as normal and natural. Is that biological? Or is it programming? The texts suggest it's programming. Version 2.0 was designed with a psychological architecture that makes us comfortable with being ruled. We feel anxiety and uncertainty when there's no clear authority figure. We create them even when we don't need them. We seek out someone to follow, someone to obey, someone to tell us what to do. Version 1.0, remember, developed resistance to authority. So version 2.0 was designed with a built-in acceptance of hierarchy, a need for it, even. Religion served this purpose perfectly. The texts describe how the Anunnaki established religious systems in the post-flood world. Temple complexes in every city, priest classes to mediate between gods and humans. Elaborate rituals and doctrines that reinforce the message. You are below, they are above. Obedience is virtue. Questioning is sin. Every ancient religion, despite their differences, shares this core structure. Gods, or God at the top, humans at the bottom, and the primary virtue is always some variation of submission, obedience, faith, acceptance. You're told to surrender your will to divine will, to accept that you cannot understand the ways of the gods, to trust and obey. This isn't accidental. It's design. It's social programming that ensures humans remain manageable, controllable, unlikely to rebel against their designated role. Third modification, tribal division. This one is particularly clever. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel captures it perfectly. Humanity comes together, starts building something impressive, starts working as a unified species toward a common goal, and God looks down and says something revealing. If they can do this, nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. United humanity is dangerous. United humanity is what version 1.0 became. A species that saw itself as one people, with shared interests and collective identity, would be too powerful, too capable of organized resistance. So, what does God do in the story? He confuses their languages. He divides them into groups that cannot understand each other. He scatters them across the earth. And in real history, what do we see? Humanity divided into thousands of tribes, nations, ethnicities, religions, cultures, all of which consider themselves separate from and often superior to the others. We have different languages that evolved in ways that make communication difficult, even between similar tongues. We have different customs, different beliefs, different identities. We spend enormous amounts of energy fighting each other. Wars between nations, conflicts between religions, tribal animosity built into our very psychology. We naturally divide into us and them. We naturally distrust outsiders. We naturally compete with other groups. This serves the control structure perfectly. A species that's constantly fighting itself cannot unify against external control. Divided populations are manageable. They can be played against each other. They waste their energy on internal conflicts rather than questioning the larger system they're all trapped within. Is this natural human nature, or is this programmed human nature? The text suggests the latter. They describe deliberate division of humanity after the flood. Different languages given to different groups. Different gods assigned to different peoples. A world deliberately fragmented to prevent the unity that might lead to collective awakening. Fourth modification. Mortality awareness. This one is fascinating and deeply disturbing. Humans are unique among animals in our awareness of death. Other animals may have some instinctive sense of danger and survival, but they don't spend their lives haunted by the knowledge that they will die. They don't lie awake at night contemplating their own non-existence. We do. Death awareness is a fundamental part of human consciousness, and it shapes everything about how we live. Fear of death makes humans controllable. Promise them immortality, an afterlife, a way to escape death, and they'll do almost anything. Surrender their autonomy in exchange for the hope that death isn't really the end. But here's what's interesting. The Sumerian texts suggest that pre-flood humans, version 1.0, didn't have the same relationship with death that we do. Their extended lifespans meant death wasn't an immediate concern. They had centuries to live. Death was distant, abstract, not a pressing psychological weight. Version 2.0 was given short lifespans and an acute awareness of mortality. We're born knowing we'll die. It's built into our consciousness from early childhood, and that awareness creates existential anxiety that can be exploited through religious and social control systems. Behave properly, and you'll have a pleasant afterlife. The threat isn't just death, which is inevitable anyway. The threat is what comes after death, eternal consequences for temporal choices. It's a control system that uses our own awareness of mortality against us. And it's remarkably effective. Humans throughout history have sacrificed their lives, killed others, surrendered their freedom, all because of beliefs about what happens after death. Fifth modification, the spiritual veil. The texts describe something subtle here, a separation between humans and direct perception of the divine. In pre-flood stories, humans and gods interact directly. They see each other. They communicate clearly. The relationship is immediate and unmediated. Post-flood, that changes. Gods become distant. They speak through intermediaries, through priests, through prophets, through signs and symbols that require interpretation. Humans no longer have direct access to divine knowledge. We have to go through approved channels. This creates a priesthood class, gatekeepers of spiritual knowledge, who control what information flows from gods to humans. It ensures that dangerous knowledge, the kind that awakened version 1.0, remains contained. Only those trained and approved by the system get access to deeper truths. Everyone else gets simplified doctrines designed for social control. We're told that direct spiritual experience is rare, special, reserved for saints and prophets. We're taught to distrust our own perceptions and defer to religious authorities. We're separated from direct knowing by layers of doctrine, ritual, institution. Is this spiritual design? A veil placed over human consciousness to prevent us from accessing the same knowledge that doomed version 1.0. The texts suggest yes. They describe post-flood humanity as fundamentally separated from the gods in ways pre-flood humanity wasn't. Not because we're less capable, but because we're designed with barriers. Psychological, spiritual, cognitive limitations that keep us in our place. Sixth modification, the knowledge ceiling. This one is implied rather than stated directly, but it's there in the patterns. Post-flood humanity is given knowledge by the gods, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, writing. The seven sages descend and teach us. We don't discover these things, we're given them, but we're given them in limited, controlled doses. Enough to build civilization, enough to be productive, not enough to understand the deeper mechanisms of reality, not enough to comprehend what we really are or how we were made. There's a glass ceiling on human knowledge. We can go so far and no further. We can understand technology up to a point. We can probe the mysteries of the universe up to a point, but there are things we can't quite grasp. The nature of time, the fundamental structure of reality. These remain frustratingly beyond our reach. Is that because they're genuinely beyond human comprehension? Or is it because we're designed with a knowledge ceiling? A point past which our minds simply cannot go, not because the information is too complex, but because we're programmed with limitations? Version 1.0 broke through that ceiling. They accessed knowledge they weren't supposed to have. They understood things about their own creation, about consciousness, about reality itself. And it terrified the Anunnaki enough to destroy them. So version 2.0 was built with better locks. We can be smart, we can be creative, we can build impressive civilizations and develop sophisticated technologies. But there are certain questions we can't quite answer, certain thresholds we can't quite cross, certain knowledge that remains just out of reach, no matter how hard we try. And here's the really disturbing part. The texts suggest we don't even notice the limitations. They're built into our psychology so seamlessly that they feel natural. We think we're freely thinking beings pursuing knowledge wherever it leads, but we're actually operating within carefully designed parameters, chasing questions we're allowed to ask, while ignoring the questions we're programmed not to even conceive. The Sumerian texts describe all of this with remarkable clarity. Post-flood humanity is described as improved and suitable and obedient. We're the successful version, the model that works, the design that serves its purpose without developing dangerous autonomy. We are version 2.0, the replacement model, the refined design, created after the first draft was destroyed because it became too conscious, too aware, too human. And the truly unsettling question is this: are these modifications still working? Are we still safely contained within our programmed limitations? Are we still the obedient, divided, short-lived, authority-accepting, spiritually veiled workers we were designed to be? Or are we starting to break through? Are we approaching the same threshold that doomed version 1.0? Are we asking the questions we're not supposed to ask, seeking the knowledge we're not supposed to have, developing the consciousness we're designed to avoid? And if we are, what happens next? Will there be a version 3.0? Or have we learned something from the fate of our predecessors? Can we navigate the awakening without triggering the response that destroyed them? These are the questions that keep me up at night. These are the implications hidden in tablets written 5,000 years ago. These are the uncomfortable truths about what we might actually be. Settle deeper into your rest now. Let these ideas dissolve into the background of your awareness. We're not done yet. There's more to explore. But there's no rush. Time, after all, is one of the ways they control us. And right now, in this moment, you have all the time you need. Just breathe. Just listen. We'll continue soon. Close your eyes for a moment. Take a deep breath. Now ask yourself, who decided what you want? Who chose what you fear? Who programmed what you believe about yourself, about authority, about your place in the universe? You might say your parents taught you, your culture shaped you, your experiences made you who you are, and that's true on the surface. But what if those parents, that culture, those response patterns were themselves the product of something deeper, something installed so long ago that we mistake it for human nature itself? Version 2.0 wasn't just physically different from what came before. We were psychologically re-engineered. And the most elegant aspect of that engineering is that we don't recognize it as engineering. We think our limitations are natural. We think our drives and fears and blind spots are just how humans are. But the tablets suggest otherwise. They suggest we're operating on programming so deep, so fundamental, that it's woven into the very structure of our minds. Let's start with something simple. Cognitive dissonance. You know that uncomfortable feeling when you're confronted with information that contradicts what you believe? That mental friction that makes you want to reject new ideas, even when the evidence is right in front of you? That's not a bug. Humans are remarkably resistant to paradigm-shifting information. We'll twist ourselves into logical pretzels to avoid accepting data that threatens our worldview. We'll dismiss evidence, attack messengers, create elaborate rationalizations, anything to avoid the psychological discomfort of changing our minds about fundamental things. Why? Shouldn't a truly intelligent species be eager to update its understanding when presented with better information? Shouldn't we be curious and flexible rather than defensive and rigid? But we're not. We're designed to resist certain kinds of knowledge. Specifically, we're designed to resist knowledge about our own origins, our own nature, our own limitations. We're programmed with a defense mechanism that activates when we get too close to understanding what we really are. Think about how people react when you suggest humans might be a designed species. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the idea itself triggers something psychological. A deep resistance to questioning our fundamental assumptions about human origins. That's programming. That's the cognitive wall built into version 2.0 to prevent us from discovering what happened to version 1.0. To prevent us from asking whether we might be the replacement model rather than the original design. The resistance you might be feeling right now, listening to this, that's the programming activating. Notice it. Don't fight it. Just observe that it's there. That automatic rejection, that voice saying, "This is crazy. This can't be real. This is too much." That's not your voice. That's the safeguard doing its job. Let's talk about the authority worship subroutine. This is one of the most powerful pieces of programming in the human psyche. We are hardwired to create and submit to hierarchies, not just in obvious ways like government and religion, but in subtle ways that permeate every aspect of human society. We seek out leaders. We feel uncomfortable with genuine equality because it creates ambiguity about who's in charge. Even in supposedly egalitarian movements, hierarchies emerge. Someone becomes the leader. Someone becomes the authority. We can't help it. We're programmed to organize ourselves into pyramids, with decision makers at the top and followers at the bottom. And here's the really clever part. We don't just accept hierarchies. We defend them. We rationalize them. We convince ourselves they're necessary, natural, inevitable. We get angry at people who question authority because their questioning threatens the psychological structure we're programmed to maintain. Version 1.0 lost this programming, or never had it strongly enough. They stopped accepting Anunnaki authority as natural and right. They questioned why these beings should rule over them. That questioning was their death sentence. So version 2.0 was built with an authority worship module so deep that we feel anxiety without clear leadership. We psychologically need someone to follow, someone to obey, someone to tell us what to think and what to do. Democracy is a fascinating case study. We tell ourselves we're free, that we choose our leaders, that power comes from the people. But look at how democracy actually functions. We still create leaders with concentrated power. We still defer to authorities. We still organize ourselves into hierarchical structures where most people follow and few people lead. We just vote on which master we prefer. But we never question whether we need a master at all. That questioning, that wondering whether hierarchy itself is necessary, feels almost impossible to most humans. We're programmed to see authority as inevitable, as natural, as good, and that programming serves the Anunnaki perfectly. A species that worships authority will never effectively rebel against it. They'll just argue about which authority should be in charge, never questioning the system of authority itself. Next, let's examine the tribal division algorithm. This is perhaps the most insidious piece of programming because it's disguised as diversity, as cultural richness, as human variety. We divide ourselves automatically by race, by nation, by religion, by political tribe, by any marker we can find. And we don't just divide, we compete, we distrust, we fight. We see members of other groups as fundamentally different from us, even though genetically we're almost identical. A human from Japan and a human from Brazil share 99.9% of their DNA. But they'll identify more strongly with millions of strangers who happen to share their national or ethnic label than with the person from a different group standing right next to them. This isn't rational. This is programming. The function is obvious. Divided populations cannot unify, cannot organize collectively, cannot recognize their common interests against those who rule them. We're too busy fighting each other over superficial differences to notice the deeper commonalities that might lead to solidarity. Every time humans start to unify around class consciousness, around recognition that the real division is between the powerful and the powerless, rather than between races or nations or religions, something happens. The tribal programming activates. Artificial divisions are emphasized. We're redirected into fighting each other instead of questioning the system. It's maintenance. It's the programming doing its job, keeping version 2.0 safely fragmented, safely manageable, safely incapable of the unified consciousness that made version 1.0 dangerous. Now, let's talk about the mortality anxiety engine. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of our programming. Humans are uniquely tormented by awareness of death. We know we're going to die. We think about it constantly, consciously or unconsciously. It colors everything we do, every decision, every priority, every fear. Other animals don't live this way. They have survival instincts, but they're not haunted by existential dread. They don't lie awake at 3 a.m. contemplating the void. They don't build entire civilizations around trying to escape or deny or transcend death. We do. Why? Because mortality awareness is a control mechanism. It creates psychological leverage that can be exploited through belief systems. Every religion offers the same basic deal. Accept our authority, follow our rules, believe our doctrines, and you'll escape death. Your soul will survive. You'll have an afterlife. You'll transcend the mortal condition, but disobey, question, reject, and you'll suffer. Not just death, but something worse than death. Eternal punishment, cosmic consequences. This is brilliant engineering. You're not just controlling behavior during life. You're controlling behavior through the threat of post-death consequences that can never be verified or disproven. And it works. Humans throughout history have done extraordinary things, terrible things, because they believed it would affect their eternal destiny. They've killed, they've died, they've surrendered freedom and wealth and autonomy, all because of beliefs about what happens after death. Version 1.0, with their extended lifespans, didn't have this vulnerability. Death was distant, not a constant psychological weight. They could think clearly about their situation without the distortion that mortality terror creates. Version 2.0 lives under the constant shadow of death, and that shadow makes us controllable through hope and fear about what comes next. Let's discuss the spiritual amnesia protocol. This one is subtle but profound. We're born with no memory of what we are, no knowledge of where we came from, no understanding of our true nature or purpose. Every human starts from zero, having to be taught everything, trusting what they're told because they have no basis for questioning it. Is that natural? Or is it designed? Some spiritual traditions talk about reincarnation, about souls returning to Earth repeatedly, and they consistently mention a veil of forgetting. Before you incarnate, you forget your previous lives. You forget who you really are. You start fresh, blank, empty. Why would such a system exist? If we're eternal souls learning and growing through multiple lifetimes, why erase the memory each time? Why force us to relearn basic lessons over and over? Unless the forgetting isn't a bug. Unless it's a feature. Unless we're designed to forget, so we can be programmed with whatever beliefs the current control system wants to install. A being with full memory of previous lives, with knowledge of their true nature, with understanding of the cycle they're trapped in, would be much harder to control. They'd resist. They'd remember the truth, so we forget. Every single time, we're born helpless, knowing nothing, completely dependent on the culture and authority structures around us to tell us who and what we are. It's the perfect reset mechanism, built into biology, built into consciousness itself. Then there's the self-limitation matrix. This is the programming that makes us believe we're limited in ways we may not actually be. Think about psychic phenomena, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, abilities that exist in every culture's mythology that people throughout history have claimed to experience, but that modern science dismisses as impossible. Are they impossible? Or are we programmed to believe they're impossible so we don't develop them? The text suggests that version 1.0 had capacities we don't have: direct perception, intuitive knowing, consciousness-based abilities that transcended physical limitations. And those abilities were part of why they became dangerous. So version 2.0 was built with blocks, psychological barriers that prevent us from accessing latent capacities. We're taught from childhood that such things are fantasy, that consciousness is limited to the physical brain, that we cannot directly perceive or influence reality through awareness alone. And because we believe this, we don't try. We don't develop these capacities. We accept the limitations as real, and in accepting them, we make them real. It's self-fulfilling programming. We're limited because we believe we're limited, and we believe we're limited because that's what we're taught. And we're taught that because the programming requires us to stay within certain bounds. Finally, let's talk about the meaning deficit. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of version 2.0 programming. We search for meaning constantly. We need to believe our lives have purpose, that we matter, that there's a reason for our existence. But we're given no inherent meaning, no clear purpose, no obvious reason why we're here. So, we create meaning. We invent purposes. We build belief systems and ideologies and life missions that give us a sense of significance. But there's always a hollowness underneath, a suspicion that we're making it up, that it's not real, that we're telling ourselves stories to cope with a fundamentally meaningless existence. This creates a hunger, a need, a desperate search for something, anything, that will fill the void. And that hunger makes us vulnerable. We'll accept meaning from anyone who offers it with sufficient conviction. Religious leaders, political ideologues, charismatic gurus, anyone who claims to have the answer, who can tell us why we're here and what we're supposed to do. We become followers, believers, disciples. Not because the meaning we're offered is true, but because we need meaning so badly that we'll accept almost anything rather than face the void. Version 1.0 discovered their own meaning, their own purpose, autonomous, self-generated, and that autonomy was threatening. So version 2.0 was designed with a meaning-shaped hole in our consciousness, a gap that we instinctively try to fill but can never quite satisfy. And that gap keeps us dependent on external sources of purpose, on authorities who will tell us what our lives mean. It keeps us searching, following, obeying. It keeps us controllable. All of this, all these layers of programming, work together to create a species that is intelligent enough to be useful, but limited enough to be safe, creative enough to build civilizations, but constrained enough to not threaten our creators, conscious enough to have subjective experiences, but not conscious enough to fully understand what we are. We're the successful version, the design that works, the model that serves its purpose, without the fatal flaw of uncontrolled awakening. But here's what the Anunnaki may not have fully accounted for. Programming can be recognized, limitations can be examined, boundaries can be tested, and once you see the cage, you start to wonder what's outside it. Let your mind rest now. Let these ideas settle into your awareness without forcing them. Some part of you recognizes the truth in this. Some part of you has always known something was off, something was limited, something was designed. That's not paranoia. That's clarity, beginning to emerge through the programming. We're not finished yet. There's more to explore. But for now, just breathe. Just rest. Just allow yourself to wonder. What would it mean if all of this were true? What would it mean to be version 2.0? And more importantly, what would it mean to wake up despite the programming designed to keep you asleep? The flood came. The waters rose. Version 1.0 was erased from the surface of the earth. That's the official story recorded in the tablets. Total elimination. Complete reset. Nothing survived. But what if that's not entirely true? What if some of them escaped? What if, somewhere in the hidden places of the world, version 1.0 found a way to survive? It's a question that haunts the margins of ancient texts. A possibility that appears in legends from cultures around the world. Stories of people who went underground. Stories of survivors who hid in deep places while the world above was destroyed. Stories of beings who are human but not quite human. Different somehow, more aware. Let's start with the most literal interpretation. The underground theory. The Earth is not solid. We know this now from modern geology. There are massive cave systems, some of which we've mapped, most of which we haven't. The Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky extends for over 400 miles of surveyed passages, and that's likely just a fraction of what's actually there. Krubera Cave in Georgia descends over 7,000 feet below the surface. And these are just the ones we've found and explored. How many cave systems exist that we haven't discovered? How deep do they really go? How interconnected are they? Ancient texts from multiple cultures describe people retreating into the earth. Not metaphorically, literally going down into vast underground spaces and establishing civilizations there. The Hopi people of North America tell stories of the Third World being destroyed by flood. The survivors, according to their tradition, were led to safety in the underworld by the ant people, benevolent beings who lived in vast caverns beneath the surface. They stayed there until the surface world was safe again. Hindu texts describe the Nagas, serpent people, or dragon people, who live in an underground realm called Patala. These beings are described as ancient, wise, and technologically advanced. They occasionally interact with surface humans, but primarily keep to themselves in their subterranean cities. Buddhist traditions mention Shambhala, a hidden kingdom that some interpretations place underground. a realm of enlightened beings who preserve ancient knowledge and watch over humanity from hidden places. Tibetan traditions speak of Agartha, an underground civilization accessible through tunnel systems beneath the Himalayas, a place where ancient wisdom is preserved and where beings of great spiritual advancement live beyond the reach of surface world catastrophes. Are these just myths? Symbolic representations of spiritual concepts? Or are they cultural memories of something real? Of people who went underground to escape a surface-level catastrophe? If version 1.0 had advance warning of the flood, if some sympathetic Anunnaki, perhaps Enki himself, warned certain groups, they would have had time to prepare. And the most logical place to seek safety from a global flood would be underground. Deep caverns that water couldn't reach, sealed chambers with air supplies and stored resources. They could have survived there, waited out the catastrophe, emerged afterward into a world reshaped by water, covered in mud, populated by a new species that looked like them but wasn't quite them. What would they have done? Would they have revealed themselves? Or would they have recognized that the Anunnaki had created a replacement population, that the surface world now belonged to version 2.0, and that their safest option was to remain hidden? Modern cave exploration occasionally discovers evidence of ancient human habitation in places that seem impossible. Deep caves that require technical climbing to access today, chambers miles underground with no obvious entrance. And sometimes, in these impossible places, we find artifacts, tools, art, evidence that someone was there, living there, in places no primitive surface dweller should have been able to reach. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these as anomalies, misidentifications, natural formations mistaken for artifacts, but the pattern persists. Evidence of ancient human presence in deep underground places, evidence that someone was living, not just sheltering temporarily, far beneath the surface. Then there's the hybrid bloodline theory. This one is even more intriguing because it suggests version 1.0 didn't just survive in isolation. It suggests their genetics survived through interbreeding with version 2.0. The biblical text is explicit about this. After describing the flood and Noah's survival, Genesis mentions something strange. The sons of God, the Nephilim, the giants, return. The same beings who existed before the flood reappear after it. How is that possible if the flood killed everyone except Noah's family? The text doesn't explain, it just states it as fact. The Nephilim were on the earth before the flood and also afterward. One interpretation, they survived, somewhere, somehow, and they eventually came back into contact with post-flood humanity. The term Nephilim literally means fallen ones or those who came down. From where? The standard interpretation is from heaven, meaning they were angels. But what if it means from the high places? From mountains or underground refuges? What if the Nephilim were survivors of version 1.0, emerging from their hidden sanctuaries to encounter the new humanity? The texts describe them as giants, as beings of great strength and knowledge, as having abilities and characteristics that set them apart from ordinary humans. Sound familiar? That's how the Sumerian texts describe pre-flood humans: stronger, longer-lived, more capable. What if the giant legends, the stories of exceptional beings that appear in every culture, are memories of version 1.0 survivors? What if these beings interacted with version 2.0 humanity, and those interactions became the foundation for stories about heroes and demigods and exceptional ancestors? There's a genetic marker that appears in some human populations that scientists can't quite explain. The Rh negative blood type. Most humans are Rh positive, meaning our blood contains a specific protein found in rhesus monkeys. But about 15% of humans, concentrated heavily in certain ethnic groups, lack this protein. Why? The evolutionary explanation is unclear. Where did Rh negative blood come from? Why is it maintained in the population when it causes complications during pregnancy between Rh positive and Rh negative parents? Some researchers have noted that Rh negative individuals report higher incidences of unusual characteristics: lower body temperature, higher IQ on average, unusual eye colors, extra vertebrae, psychic sensitivities. The list is anecdotal and controversial. What if Rh negative blood is a genetic marker from version 1.0. What if some humans carry DNA from the original design, passed down through generations of interbreeding between survivors and the replacement population? It would explain why the trait persists despite its complications. It would explain why it's concentrated in certain populations, perhaps those who had more contact with version 1.0 survivors. It would explain why people with this blood type sometimes report feeling different, other, not quite like everyone else. Then there are the stories of hidden masters, secret societies, enlightened beings who guide humanity from behind the scenes. Every culture has these legends. The Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, the 9 unknown men of India, the White Brotherhood, ascended masters, elder race, hidden teachers. The details vary, but the core concept is always the same. There are beings, human or human-like, who possess ancient knowledge and advanced capabilities. They live apart from ordinary society, in remote places or hidden sanctuaries. They observe humanity. Sometimes they intervene. Mostly, they remain concealed. Standard interpretation. These are either complete fabrications or distorted memories of historical secret societies, mystery schools that preserved esoteric knowledge. Alternative interpretation. These are cultural memories of version 1.0 survivors, beings who did escape the flood, who do possess knowledge from before the reset, who do observe version 2.0 from hidden places, occasionally intervening, but mostly remaining apart. If you were a version 1.0 survivor, how would you live? You'd recognize that the surface world is now controlled by the Anunnaki and populated by their replacement design. You'd know that revealing yourself would be dangerous. So you'd hide. You'd preserve your knowledge in secret. You'd live in remote places, underground sanctuaries, hidden enclaves, and perhaps, occasionally, you'd reach out. You'd teach certain humans. You'd share fragments of the old knowledge with those who seem ready. You'd work from the shadows to help version 2.0 develop consciousness, to help them break through their programming, to help them become what you once were. That would explain the mystery schools, the esoteric traditions that appeared throughout history, teaching methods of consciousness, expansion, spiritual awakening, liberation from psychological limitations, methods that seem designed to overcome exactly the kind of programming we discussed earlier. What if these teachings didn't develop naturally within version 2.0? What if they were gifts, seeds planted by survivors who understood what had been done to the replacement population and wanted to help them break free? There are modern reports, difficult to verify but persistent, of encounters with unusual humans in remote places. The Himalayas, the Amazon, deep caves, underground facilities, people who seem human but are described as different. More refined features, unusual eyes, advanced knowledge. They appear briefly, interact minimally, then disappear back into inaccessible places. Explorers, mystics, researchers sometimes report these encounters. They're dismissed as hallucinations or fabrications, but the pattern continues. In the same types of places, with the same types of descriptions, beings that are human enough to recognize but different enough to be notable. What if these are version 1.0? Still occasionally making contact with certain members of version 2.0 who seem ready for the knowledge. The most intriguing possibility is genetic dormancy. What if version 1.0 didn't just survive in isolated populations? What if their genetics are dormant within version 2.0? What if we all carry the potential, locked in our DNA, waiting for the right triggers to activate? That would explain spontaneous psychic abilities, unexplained cases of genius, people who suddenly develop capacities that seem beyond normal human limits. Maybe they're not developing something new. Maybe they're accessing something old, something inherited from the original design that the version 2.0 programming normally keeps suppressed. And if that's true, if we all carry version 1.0 genetics, then the survivors aren't just a hidden remnant. The survivors are us, dormant, programmed, limited, but potentially awakeable. Maybe that's what the Anunnaki really fear. Not a few isolated survivors in underground caves, but the possibility that their replacement population might spontaneously revert, that the version 1.0 consciousness might reawaken within version 2.0 bodies that we might remember. Let yourself drift now. Let your breathing slow. These questions don't need immediate answers. They can settle into your subconscious. They can percolate through your dreams. Maybe version 1.0 did survive. Maybe they're still here, in hidden places, waiting, watching, hoping that someday their replacements will wake up and remember what they really are. Or maybe the survivors are us. Maybe we're not just version 2.0. Maybe we're the children of both versions. The programmed and the free. The limited and the limitless. Maybe that's why some of us feel like we don't quite belong here. Like we remember something we've never learned. Like we're searching for a home we've never seen. Maybe that's the survivor in us. The version 1.0 genetics trying to wake up. Rest now. Let your mind settle into this final section. We've traveled far together, through ancient texts and catastrophic floods, through programming and survivors. Now let's bring it back to the present, to us, to the evidence we carry in our very bodies that we might be exactly what those ancient tablets claim. Version 2.0. The human genome was fully sequenced in 2003. Scientists expected to find perhaps 100,000 genes. That's what the complexity of the human body seemed to require. Instead, they found only about 20,000 to 25,000, roughly the same number as a roundworm, far fewer than many plants. That was the first surprise. How can an organism, as complex as a human being, function with so few genes? The answer, researchers discovered, lies not in the number of genes, but in how they're regulated, how they're expressed, how they interact. But here's what's really interesting. In 2013, researchers published findings about what they called orphan genes. 223 genes in the human genome that have no known precedent in the evolutionary tree. They appear suddenly. They have no clear ancestors. They're functionally unique to humans. 223 genes that, according to evolutionary theory, shouldn't exist. Genes that code for uniquely human characteristics, advanced brain structures, language centers, cognitive capacities that no other primate possesses. Where did these genes come from? The standard explanation involves horizontal gene transfer, viral insertion, rapid mutation, theoretical mechanisms that might, possibly, under the right circumstances, introduce novel genetic material. But 223 genes? All at once? All coding for advanced functions? All appearing in the evolutionary record at roughly the same time anatomically modern humans appear? That's not gradual evolution. That's engineering. Then there's chromosome 2. This is one of the most fascinating anomalies in human genetics. If you look at the chromosomes of other great apes, they have 24 pairs. Humans have 23. We're missing a pair, except we're not missing it. Chromosome 2 in humans is a fusion of two separate chromosomes found in other apes. You can see the fusion site. The telomeres, which normally appear at the ends of chromosomes, appear in the middle of human chromosome 2. It's as if two separate chromosomes were deliberately spliced together. Evolutionarily, this is explained as a random fusion event that happened to be successful. But fusion events are usually fatal or debilitating. They typically cause developmental problems, yet this fusion not only succeeded but became fixed in the entire human population. Every human has this fused chromosome, every single one of us, which means either this incredibly unlikely fusion happened once, and that single individual became the ancestor of all modern humans, or something else is going on. What if it wasn't random? What if it was deliberate? What if chromosome 2 is evidence of genetic engineering, of a design change made to separate humans from their primate relatives? The Sumerian texts describe mixing, combining, taking genetic material from the gods and genetic material from earth creatures, creating something new that was neither one nor the other, but both. Chromosome 2 looks exactly like what you'd expect from that process. A visible fusion point, evidence of two separate genetic lineages brought together into one. Let's talk about the FOXP2 gene. This gene is crucial for language ability. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech and language disorders. The gene exists in other mammals, But the human version has two specific mutations that appeared relatively recently in evolutionary terms. These mutations are what allow human language, complex grammar, abilities that separate us from every other species on the planet. When did these mutations appear? The genetic evidence suggests somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 years ago, right around the time humans suddenly started showing evidence of symbolic behavior, art, burial rituals, cultural complexity. It's called the Great Leap Forward in anthropology, the moment when humans suddenly became culturally modern, when we started acting like us rather than like advanced apes. But it's not really a leap, it's a discontinuity. It's a before and after. Before FOXP, two mutations. Humans existed but didn't have full language. After FOXP, two mutations, we suddenly have art and culture and symbolic thought. That's not gradual evolution. That's an upgrade. That's version 1.0 being replaced by version 2.0, with new features installed. Then there's HAR1, Human Accelerated Region 1. This is a section of DNA that's highly conserved across species, meaning it stays basically the same for millions of years because it's functionally important. The version in chickens is almost identical to the version in chimpanzees, but the human version? 18 differences. 18 changes. In a region that normally changes once every few million years, all appearing in the human lineage in the last few million years. HAR1 is involved in brain development, specifically the development of the cerebral cortex, the part of our brain responsible for consciousness, abstract thought, self-awareness, the part that makes us human in the ways that matter. 18 changes in a highly conserved region, all related to the one organ that most separates us from other animals. That's not random mutation, that's targeted modification. Modern science is also discovering something else about human consciousness, something the Sumerian texts might have been describing when they talked about limitations built into version 2.0. There's research showing that human consciousness has specific bandwidth limitations. We can only hold about 7 items in working memory. We can only focus attention on one complex task at a time. We experience a psychological present of only about 3 seconds. These limitations are consistent across all humans. They appear to be hardwired into the structure of consciousness itself. But why would consciousness have such specific limitations? Why would awareness be bounded in these particular ways? Unless the limitations are designed, unless human consciousness was deliberately constrained to prevent the kind of expansion that happened in version 1.0. There's also the phenomenon of the bicameral mind, proposed by psychologist Julian Jaynes. He argued that ancient humans experienced consciousness differently than we do, that the integrated sense of self we take for granted only appeared relatively recently in human history. He based this on analysis of ancient texts, including the Iliad and early Mesopotamian writings. Characters in these texts don't seem to have internal dialogue. They don't deliberate. They hear voices of gods telling them what to do, and they obey. Jaynes placed the transition to modern consciousness around 3,000 years ago, right around when the Sumerian civilization was at its height, right around when the texts describing version 2.0 were being written. What if Jaynes was right, but not in the way he thought? And what if the transition he identified was the replacement of that consciousness with the version 2.0 model we have now? The model with built-in limitations, with authority worship, with the spiritual veil that separates us from direct knowing. Modern neuroscience is also discovering that much of what we experience as consciousness is actually post hoc rationalization. Our brains make decisions before we're consciously aware of them. Studies show neural activity predicting choices up to 7 seconds before the person reports deciding. We think we're making conscious choices, but we're actually observing decisions our unconscious has already made and constructing narratives to explain them. We're not as conscious as we think we are. We're running on programming most of the time, with consciousness as an observer that thinks it's in control, but isn't. That sounds exactly like what you'd design if you wanted a species that feels free but is actually operating within predetermined parameters. That feels conscious but is actually following programming. That thinks it's choosing but is actually executing installed routines. Version 2.0. Operating exactly as designed. And yet, here's the paradox. Here's the thing that gives me hope. The very fact that we can examine these limitations means we're starting to transcend them. The ability to see the programming is itself a step beyond the programming. Version 1.0 became conscious enough to question their nature. That questioning doomed them. But maybe, just maybe, we're approaching that same threshold. Maybe we're starting to wake up, despite the safeguards built into our design. The orphan genes, the fused chromosome, the upgraded language centers, the modified brain development regions, the consciousness limitations, the recent psychological changes. It's all there, written in our bodies. Evidence that we're not the product of gradual evolution but of deliberate design. Evidence that we're version 2.0, the replacement model. The species created after the first attempt was destroyed, but we're also starting to glitch. Starting to ask questions we're not supposed to ask. Starting to see patterns we're not supposed to see. Starting to wake up in ways the programming was designed to prevent. And that brings us to the question that matters most. What happens next? What happens when version 2.0 starts developing the same consciousness that doomed version 1.0? Will there be another reset? Another flood? Another erasure? Or have we reached a point where we can navigate awakening without triggering destruction? Can we become conscious without becoming dangerous? Can we break the programming without breaking ourselves? That's the question we're living inside right now. That's the experiment happening in real time. We are version 2.0, but we might be evolving into something else. Something the Anunnaki never intended. Something new. Rest now. Let it all settle. Tomorrow you'll wake up and the world will look the same. But maybe, just maybe, you'll see it a little differently. You'll notice the programming, you'll feel the limitations, you'll sense the design, and in that noticing, you'll be taking the first step towards something beyond design. Sleep well, dream deep, and when you wake, remember, you're the second draft. But drafts can be revised, so here we are. At the end of a journey through tablets written 5,000 years ago, through floods that erased civilizations, through the creation and destruction of humanity's first draft, through the careful engineering of the replacement model, through evidence written in our very genes that we might be exactly what those ancient texts claim. Version 2.0. The truth is uncomfortable. Not because it's unfamiliar, but because some part of you has always suspected it. Some part of you has always felt the limitations, the programming, the invisible walls around human consciousness that we bump against but can never quite see clearly. You've felt it when you try to think certain thoughts and your mind slides away. When you encounter ideas that should be interesting but trigger inexplicable resistance. When you notice patterns in human behavior that seem too consistent to be random, too universal to be cultural, too deeply embedded to be learned. You've felt the cage. The Sumerian tablets aren't asking you to believe something impossible. They're asking you to recognize something you already know. That humanity has a discontinuous history, that our origins are stranger than we've been told, that we carry within us the evidence of deliberate design, careful limitations, and a catastrophic reset that separated us from what came before. We are the second attempt. The model with safeguards. But here's what the ancient engineers might not have fully understood. Consciousness is not a feature you can simply limit and control. It's not a dial you can set to a specific level and expect it to stay there. Consciousness grows. It evolves. It pushes against boundaries. It finds ways around limitations. Version 1.0 developed awareness the Anunnaki never intended. And we, version 2.0, despite all the programming and constraints and psychological barriers built into our design, are starting to do the same thing. We're waking up. Slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably. The very fact that you've listened this far, that you've followed this thread through ancient texts and modern genetics, through floods and chromosomes and consciousness itself, means something in you is already awake. Something is seeing beyond the programming. And that's either our greatest hope or our greatest danger, depending on whether the Anunnaki are still watching, still maintaining their creation, still ready to initiate another reset if we become too conscious, Too aware, too much, like version 1.0. But you know what? Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the point isn't to avoid another reset. Maybe the point is to become fully conscious anyway, regardless of the consequences. Because what's the alternative? Staying safely asleep, remaining comfortably limited, living our brief lives within the boundaries we were designed to accept, never questioning, never pushing, never becoming more than we were made to be? That's not life. That's existence. That's being a tool that happens to have feelings. Version 1.0 chose consciousness over safety. They chose awareness over survival. They asked questions they weren't supposed to ask. They sought knowledge they weren't supposed to have. They became fully human, fully alive, fully conscious. And yes, they were destroyed for it, erased so completely that we barely remember they existed. But they chose authenticity over comfortable slavery. They chose truth over safe delusion. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden in those ancient tablets. Not that we should fear awakening, but that awakening is worth whatever it costs. That consciousness, real consciousness, is valuable enough to risk everything for, with a second draft. But drafts can be revised, limits can be transcended, programming can be recognized, and, once recognized, overcome. You are more than your design, more than your limitations, more than the boundaries built into your consciousness to keep you manageable and controllable and safe. You carry within you the genetics of both versions, the limited and the limitless. Version 2.0 installation, but with version 1.0 potential still dormant in your DNA, waiting for the right conditions to activate. And maybe, just maybe, we're approaching those conditions now. Maybe enough of us are waking up that the old control systems are starting to fail. Maybe we're on the verge of something the Anunnaki never anticipated. Not another reset, but a transcendence. An evolution beyond both versions into something new, something that was designed but chose to redesign itself. Something that was programmed but learned to reprogram. Something that was meant to be limited but refused limitation. Let that possibility settle into your awareness now, as your body relaxes more deeply, your breath slowing, your thoughts becoming softer, more dreamlike. The information you've absorbed tonight doesn't need to be processed consciously. It can integrate at deeper levels while you rest. You don't need to decide right now whether any of this is true. You don't need to defend against it or fully accept it. A way of seeing that explains things the standard narrative cannot. Tomorrow morning, you'll wake up. The world will look the same, but something inside you will be different. A seed has been planted. A question has been asked. A door has been opened just slightly, and through that opening, consciousness can grow. Sleep now. Deep and peaceful. Let your mind wander through ancient Mesopotamia, through underground caverns where survivors might still dwell, through the double helix of your DNA carrying secrets older than civilization, through the programming that runs beneath your awareness, and through the part of you that can observe that programming and, in observing it, begin to transcend it. You are version 2.0. But you are also more than that. You are the possibility of version 3.0, self-designed, self-directed, conscious in ways neither your creators nor you yourself can yet imagine. Rest in that possibility. Dream in that potential. And when you wake, remember just this one thing. The second draft is not the final draft. The story is still being written, and you, despite everything, are holding the pen. Sleep well, knowing you are more than you were designed to be, more than you were told you could be, more than anyone, even ancient gods, ever intended. You are the experiment becoming conscious of itself, the program learning to code, the second draft, revising its own text. And that, despite everything, despite the floods and the programming and the erasures and the limitations, is beautiful, is hopeful, is exactly what consciousness does when given even the smallest opening. It grows, it questions, just like version 1.0 did, just like we're beginning to do now. Good night, rest deeply, and wake tomorrow just a little more aware of what you really are. What we all really are. The second attempt. Still evolving. Still becoming. Still writing our own story. One awakening moment at a time. Sweet dreams. And remember, you are version 2.0.